Do not show up to the wedding. My sister erased my entire existence with one single text message. I silently walked out of the bridal boutique and booked a one-way flight to Hawaii. A week later, her absolute dream day crashed and burned into public humiliation. My phone vibrated endlessly. 199 missed calls. I stood on a circular velvet pedestal surrounded by gilded mirrors that reflected a woman trying entirely too hard to fit into a world that did not want her. The bridal boutique in downtown Atlanta smelled of expensive champagne vanilla and pure desperation. I was 32 years old and about to hand over $2,500 of my own hard-earned money for a pale blush bridesmaid dress that pinched my ribs and completely washed out my dark brown skin. My younger sister Jada had insisted on this specific color. She told everyone it would provide the perfect neutral palette for her wedding photos. But I knew the truth. She chose it because it complemented the fair skin of her future sister-in-law Caroline, while making me look dull and faded in comparison. I was adjusting the rigid tulle fabric around my waist when my phone vibrated in my leather purse resting on the tufted bench nearby. I stepped down carefully from the pedestal, gathering the heavy fabric in one hand, and reached for my phone. The screen illuminated with a text message from Jada. I expected a mundane question about the dress alterations, or perhaps a complaint about the floral arrangements arriving late. Instead, the words on the glowing screen made the air in my lungs turn to absolute ice. Spencer family is very traditional old money. Your natural hair is too unkempt, your weight does not fit the aesthetic, and your property management job is embarrassing to explain to them. Mom agrees. Do not bother coming to the wedding. I cannot risk you ruining my image. I read the message twice. Then I read it a third time to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. The cruelty was so precise and so calculated that it felt like a physical strike directly to my chest. Jada was 28 years old and had spent the last 5 years building a completely fake life as a social media influencer. She curated every single moment, every friendship, and every family interaction to project an illusion of effortless wealth and untouchable status. Her fiancé, Spencer Kensington, was a white man from a family that constantly boasted about their historical lineage and generational wealth. From the exact moment Jada met him, she began aggressively erasing any part of her own identity that might make his conservative family uncomfortable. And apparently that erasure now permanently included her own sister. Before I could even process the profound betrayal, another notification popped up on my screen. This one was from our mother Yvonne. Do not make a scene, Aaliyah. The Kensingtons are high society. You are always too loud and too unapologetically black. Let your sister secure this bag. I stared at my mother message and a cold, bitter laugh caught in the back of my throat. Let your sister secure this bag. That was the exact phrase my mother had used our entire lives to justify prioritizing Jada over me. Growing up in our affluent but deeply status-obsessed household in Atlanta, I was always treated as the difficult child simply because I refused to conform. When I was working grueling double shifts in college to pay my tuition, Yvonne was taking out high-interest personal loans to buy Jada designer handbags so she could fit in with the wealthy girls at her university. When I started my first real estate business, working late nights out of a cramped studio apartment, Yvonne told all our relatives I was just a glorified landlord. Meanwhile, she bragged endlessly about Jada landing a brief unpaid internship at a lifestyle magazine. I was always deemed too much for them. I was too dark, too thick, too outspoken, and entirely too unwilling to shrink myself to make white people comfortable. Jada, on the other hand, had mastered the destructive art of reshaping her entire existence to fit whatever mold would gain her access to elite circles. She stopped wearing braids, she changed her accent around Spencer friends, and she distanced herself from anyone who did not fit the wealthy country club aesthetic. I looked at myself in the mirror. The blush dress looked absolutely ridiculous on me. Jada knew that when she picked it out. She wanted me to look foolish standing next to Spencer's tall, blonde, and incredibly thin sister Caroline. But now I would not be standing next to them at all. I reached around the back of the dress and gripped the cold metal zipper. I did not shed a single tear. I had cried all my tears for this toxic family years ago when I finally realized that their love was entirely conditional upon my financial usefulness and my absolute compliance. I unzipped the dress and let the heavy silk and tulle pool around my ankles on the velvet carpet. I stepped out of it and put my own clothes back on. A comfortable pair of wide-leg slacks and a tailored silk blouse that fit my body perfectly. I picked up my phone and typed a response to my sister. "No worries, enjoy your day." I hit send, and then I went into my phone settings and blocked her number. I opened the message from my mother, and I blocked her number too. I picked up the discarded bridesmaid dress, draped it over my arm, and carried it out of the fitting room. The sales attendant, a young woman with a measuring tape draped around her neck, rushed over with a bright, practiced customer service smile. "How is the fit?" she asked, her eyes darting to the dress over my arm. "Do we need to take it in at the waist before the final fitting?" I handed her the heavy garment. "I will not be needing it," I said, my voice perfectly level and steady. "The wedding plans have changed." I walked out of the bridal boutique and out into the warm afternoon air. As I reached my car, I opened a travel application on my phone. I had cleared my entire professional schedule for the next 2 weeks to deal with Jada wedding festivities. I had prepared myself for the rehearsal dinners, the bridal showers, and the endless, agonizing social events where I would have been required to stand quietly in the background while Spencer family looked down their noses at me. Now I had 14 days of absolute, uninterrupted freedom. I scrolled through the available flights and booked a first-class one-way ticket to Maui, Hawaii, leaving that exact same night. I drove straight back to my house, packed a single suitcase with my best resort, where my favorite natural hair products that my family found so offensive, and my heavily encrypted work laptop. The transition from the suffocating expectations of my family to the sleek, quiet environment of the airport, first-class lounge felt like shedding a heavy winter coat in the middle of summer. I sat in a leather armchair, sipped sparkling water with lime, and watched the massive planes take off into the night sky, feeling a profound sense of detachment. They thought they were punishing me. They thought excluding me from this grand society wedding would break my heart and force me into a state of submission. They truly believed I would spend the entire weekend sobbing alone in my house, feeling horribly inferior to the great Spencer Kensington and his old money pedigree. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I boarded the flight just before midnight. The first-class cabin was dimly lit, peaceful, and completely isolated from the chaos of the main terminal. I settled into my spacious pod, accepted a warm, scented towel from the flight attendant, and opened my encrypted tablet. While my family thought I was just a basic property manager struggling to get by, they had completely missed the massive empire I had been quietly building right under their noses for the past decade. Over the last 10 years, I had taken my small real estate business and turned it into a massive, highly lucrative portfolio of luxury commercial and residential properties. To protect my privacy and to avoid the exact kind of toxic financial manipulation I was currently experiencing from my parents, I had legally placed all my significant assets into a blind trust. I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, a real estate company worth tens of millions of dollars. I navigated to my secure corporate email and opened a specific file sent by my estate manager earlier that week. It was a venue rental contract for $150,000. The contract was signed in bold black ink by Spencer Kensington. I zoomed in on the signature on the screen and smiled a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. Jada and Yvonne had been bragging for months about the ultra-exclusive, breathtaking venue Spencer family had secured for the wedding. The Vanguard Estate, a massive historic property outside the city with sprawling botanical gardens, a private reflecting lake, and towering iron gates that kept out anyone who was not on the elite guest list. It was the absolute crown jewel of Spencer, attempt to prove his ultimate high society status to my status-obsessed mother and sister. What Jada, Yvonne, and Spencer did not know, and what they could not possibly have known, was that the Vanguard Estate, the very ground they were planning to walk on to celebrate their exclusionary, bigoted dream wedding, belonged entirely to me. I owned the venue. I owned the gates. I owned the luxury bridal suites where Jada planned to get ready. I owned the ground beneath their feet. And as I leaned back in my luxurious first-class seat, feeling the thrust of the engines as the plane flew thousands of miles away toward the Pacific Ocean. I realized that the power dynamic of my entire life had completely shifted. They told me I did not fit their aesthetic. They told me I was not worthy of a single seat at their table. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the entire building, and they had no idea what kind of storm was coming for them. The flight was long and smooth, providing me with hours of uninterrupted time to think about the years of mistreatment I had endured. I thought about how my father Calvin always enabled my mother behavior. Whenever Yvonne would criticize my weight or my natural hair, Calvin would simply look away and tell me to be the bigger person. Being the bigger person was just their code word for accepting disrespect quietly. They wanted me to be a silent, compliant prop in the background of Jada Perfect Life. I logged into the flight wireless internet and checked the latest reports from my estate manager, Elias. Elias was a seasoned professional who managed the day-to-day operations of the Vanguard estate with military precision. He had sent me a brief update on the wedding preparations. The Kensington family had requested several massive changes to the landscaping and the catering menu at the very last minute. Spencer's sister Caroline had apparently visited the estate earlier that day and made several demands that violated the terms of the contract. I read through Elias' notes, detailing how Caroline had spoken to the staff. It sent a hot flash of protective anger through my veins. I did not tolerate anyone disrespecting my employees, especially not entitled people who thought their skin color and their bank accounts gave them permission to treat service workers like garbage. But I told Elias to hold off on taking any immediate action. I needed them to feel completely comfortable and secure in their plans. I needed them to believe that everything was going perfectly smoothly. I closed the tablet and looked out the airplane window at the stars dotting the black sky over the ocean. For the first time in my 32 years of life, I did not feel the crushing weight of my family disappointment dragging me down. The anxiety that usually plagued me before family events was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I was no longer the scapegoat sister trying desperately to earn the love of a mother who only valued proximity to whiteness and wealth. I was a self-made multimillionaire, flying to a tropical island, while the people who had just thrown me away prepared to host the most important event of their lives on my property. I closed my eyes and let the steady hum of the airplane lull me to sleep, knowing that when I woke up in paradise, the real work would begin. The wedding was still exactly 7 days away. 7 days for them to finalize their seating charts, their floral arrangements, and their arrogant assumptions about my place in the world. 7 days until the illusion they had built together would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I had spent my entire life being pushed out of the frame. Now I was going to rewrite the entire script. The flight to Maui felt like crossing into an entirely new reality. I stepped off the plane and let the warm tropical air wash over me, leaving the suffocating expectations of my family far behind in Atlanta. By noon, I was lounging in a private oceanfront cabana at a luxury resort. The sound of the Pacific Ocean waves crashing against the shore provided a soothing rhythm that completely drowned out any lingering thoughts of the pale blush bridesmaid dress I had left on a fitting room floor. I settled back into the plush white cushions, holding a chilled glass of fresh pineapple juice, and opened my secure work tablet. I had built a massive real estate empire entirely under the radar, using a blind trust to protect my assets from my status-obsessed parents. They thought I was a struggling property manager, but I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. And the Vanguard estate, the breathtaking venue where my sister Jada was desperately trying to impress her white, wealthy fiancé Spencer Kensington, belonged entirely to me. My peaceful solitude was interrupted when my phone vibrated on the small wooden table next to my lounge chair. The screen displayed a call from Elias. He was my estate manager at Vanguard, a meticulous white man in his late 50s, who ran my flagship property with absolute military precision. Elias knew exactly how I preferred things to operate, and he never bothered me unless it was an absolute emergency. I set my drink down and answered the call, expecting a routine update on the wedding preparations. Elias spoke with his usual measured tone, but I could hear a distinct layer of irritation beneath his professional demeanor. He informed me that he was calling to report a highly concerning incident regarding the Kensington wedding setup. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and told him to explain everything. Elias detailed how Spencer's sister, Caroline Kensington, had arrived at the Vanguard estate earlier that morning for a final walkthrough of the grounds. She was supposed to be reviewing the floral placements, but instead she decided to completely terrorize my catering staff. Elias explained that Caroline had cornered the lead catering director, a brilliant and hardworking black woman named Sarah, and began making a series of deeply offensive and coded racist remarks. Caroline complained that the service style felt too ghetto and unrefined for her family standards. She explicitly demanded that the entire black waitstaff be replaced with an all-white team before the wedding reception began. She claimed that her wealthy relatives would feel deeply uncomfortable being served by people who did not fit the pristine aesthetic of a high society event. Elias sounded genuinely disgusted as he relayed her exact words to me. He told me he had stepped in immediately to protect Sarah and the rest of the staff. He calmly informed Caroline that the Vanguard estate provided its own elite catering team and that absolutely no personnel changes would be made based on discriminatory preferences. Caroline had apparently thrown a massive tantrum, threatening to have Elias fired. She screamed that she would speak to the owner of the estate and ensure that his career was ruined. I listened to Elias finish his report, and a cold, heavy anger settled deep in my stomach. The sheer audacity of this woman coming onto my property and disrespecting my employees filled me with a quiet but absolute rage. I told Elias that he handled the situation perfectly. I instructed him to pull the security camera audio and video footage from the dining hall where the confrontation took place and send it directly to my secure email. I wanted every single word Caroline said permanently documented. I assured Elias that his job was completely safe and that the owner of the estate was very much aware of the situation. I ended the call and took a deep breath, letting the ocean breeze cool my rising temper. Less than 20 minutes after I spoke with Elias, my phone vibrated again. This time, the caller identification showed my father, Calvin. I stared at the screen, watching his name flash. He had not called me once to ask how I felt about being uninvited from my own sister's wedding. I had not sent a single text message to check if I was okay after being told my natural hair and my dark skin were too embarrassing to be seen around the Kensingtons. I knew exactly why he was calling now. I answered the phone and held it to my ear without saying a word. Calvin did not even bother with a greeting. His voice boomed through the speaker, loud and frantic. He immediately demanded that I wire him $15,000 by the end of the day. He sounded completely out of breath, as if he had been pacing around the house in a state of sheer panic. I asked him calmly why he needed $15,000 so urgently. He snapped at me, saying that Spencer's family had requested a live symphony string quartet to play during the cocktail hour. The Kensingtons considered a standard jazz band to be completely unacceptable for their caliber of guests. Jada had eagerly agreed to the string quartet to impress them, but she was entirely out of cash. Her credit cards were maxed out from buying designer shoes and luxury beauty treatments to keep up her fake influencer lifestyle. Calvin told me that the symphony required full payment up front and that the family was in a desperate situation. He told me I was single with no kids, and therefore I had no real expenses. He demanded that I send the money immediately so they would not look poor in front of the Kensingtons. His exact words echoed in my ear. "We cannot let these white folks think we do not have money, Aaliyah. Send the cash right now so your sister does not look like a fool." I sat in my cabana, listening to my father prioritize a fake display of wealth over basic human decency. He was perfectly willing to drain my bank account just to buy the approval of a family that actively looked down on us. I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion as I told him no. I told him I would not be sending him $15,000 for a string quartet or for anything else. The line went completely silent for a moment before Calvin erupted. He started yelling about family loyalty and duty. He accused me of being a bitter and jealous older sister who wanted to sabotage Jada because I could not find a wealthy man of my own. I let him yell until he ran out of breath. Then I told him that I had something very important to share with him. I told him to check his text messages. While we were on the phone, Elias had sent me the security footage from the dining hall. I forwarded the audio file directly to my father. I told Calvin to listen to the recording of Caroline Kensington speaking to the catering staff at the venue. I told him to listen very closely to how the Kensingtons truly felt about Black people when they thought no one important was watching. I hung up the phone before he could say another word. I leaned back against my cushions, feeling a strange sense of peace. I knew the audio recording was damning. It captured Caroline using vile racist language and treating hardworking Black professionals like garbage. I thought surely my father would hear that and realize that no amount of string quartets or designer dresses would ever make the Kensingtons respect them. I thought surely this would be the wake-up call they needed to stop begging for a seat at a table where they were despised. 10 minutes passed before my phone rang again. It was not my father. It was my mother, Yvonne. I answered the call, expecting her to be furious about the recording. I expected her to finally express some outrage over how Spencer's sister was behaving. Instead, her voice was tight with annoyance directed entirely at me. She asked me why I was causing unnecessary drama right before the wedding. I was genuinely stunned. I asked her if she had listened to the audio file of Caroline insulting Black people and demanding a white waitstaff. Yvonne sighed heavily, as if I were a foolish child who simply did not understand how the real world worked. She told me she had listened to it and that I was overreacting. Her exact words were chilling. "That is just how the elite operate, Aaliyah. You are too sensitive." She went on to explain that wealthy white families like the Kensingtons had specific standards and expectations for their events. She said Caroline was just being particular about the service, and that I was trying to turn a simple misunderstanding into a racial issue. Yvonne told me I needed to stop looking for problems where none existed. She told me I was trying to ruin Jada's happiness because I was resentful about being uninvited. She commanded me to wire the $15,000 to my father immediately and to stop sending them upsetting audio clips. She said Jada was about to marry into an important family and that we all needed to make sacrifices to ensure the event was flawless. I listened to my mother completely excuse blatant racism just so she could maintain her proximity to white wealth. The sickness in my family ran so deep that it had completely eroded their self-respect. They were willing to smile and nod while being degraded as long as they could take photos in a mansion and pretend they belonged. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or try to make her see reason. I simply told her that I would not be sending any money and that I hoped the string quartet was worth their dignity. I hung up the phone and blocked her number. I set my phone down on the table and looked out at the crystal clear blue water of the ocean. My family was truly a lost cause. They had chosen their path and now they would have to walk it all the way to the bitter end. I reached for my glass of pineapple juice, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that I was thousands of miles away from their toxic delusions. I was safe on my island, surrounded by the wealth I had built through my own intelligence and hard work. I did not need to beg anyone for respect, because I had already earned it for myself. I opened my encrypted tablet to review my final emails for the day. My banking application had an urgent automated alert flagged at the top of the screen. I tapped the notification and opened the secure message from my corporate financial department. It was regarding the Vanguard estate accounts. The final payment for the venue rental was due today. Spencer Kensington had submitted a cashier's check for $100,000 to secure the property for the weekend. I read the automated bank report, slowly letting the words sink in. I stared at the automated alert on my encrypted tablet for a long time, letting the words sink deeply into my mind. The $100,000 cashier check from Spencer Kensington had bounced. Account insufficient. A slow and deeply genuine smile spread across my face as I sat alone in my luxurious oceanfront cabana. The great Spencer Kensington, the man with the supposedly historic lineage and the vast generational wealth, did not have enough money in his bank account to cover a simple venue rental. The old money was completely gone. He was entirely broke. My sister Jada was desperately trying to secure a bag that was completely empty, and they were all about to find out the hard way. I locked my tablet and watched the Hawaiian sun slowly begin its descent over the Pacific Ocean. The vibrant hues of orange and purple bleeding across the sky stood in sharp contrast to the absolute darkness I was about to rain down on my deeply toxic family. I woke up the next morning feeling more refreshed and focused than I had in years. I ordered a pot of Kona coffee and a plate of fresh fruit to my suite. While my mother Yvonne and my sister Jada were undoubtedly running around Atlanta in a state of sheer panic over wedding cake flavors and floral arrangements, I was preparing to execute a flawless financial autopsy. I opened my secure laptop and initiated a video call with my chief legal counsel, David. David was a brilliant, incredibly ruthless corporate attorney who handled all the acquisitions and background checks for Vanguard Holdings. I told him I needed a comprehensive, quiet, and aggressive financial background check on the entire Kensington family. I wanted to see absolutely everything: tax records, business filings, credit histories, and any outstanding property liens. I needed to know exactly how deep their financial grave truly was. David nodded, confirming he understood the assignment and assured me I would have the complete dossier within a few hours. I spent the early part of the afternoon enjoying the luxurious amenities of the resort. I swam in the crystal-clear ocean, treated myself to a long, hot stone massage, and ate fresh seafood while listening to the gentle crash of the waves. It was a beautiful contrast to the absolute storm I was brewing. I felt absolutely no guilt. Every time a small twinge of hesitation tried to creep into my mind, I simply remembered the sheer cruelty of Jada's text message and my mother demanding that I shrink my blackness to make white people comfortable. They had made their choices, and now they were going to choke on the consequences of their own actions. By late afternoon, the encrypted file from David arrived in my secure inbox. I sat at the glass dining table in my villa, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and opened the massive dossier. What I read was so hilariously devastating that I actually had to set my coffee cup down to avoid spilling it from laughing out loud. The great Kensington family, the untouchable old money dynasty that my mother was so desperate to align herself with, was a complete and utter fraud. According to the extensive financial records David uncovered, the Kensington family, old money had completely dried up back in 2014. Spencer's father had made a series of catastrophic commercial real estate investments, and their primary family holding company had quietly filed for bankruptcy protection nearly a decade ago. To maintain their wealthy high society facade, they had been borrowing heavily against their rapidly dwindling assets. The legal documents showed massive federal tax liens against Spencer's parents. They owed the Internal Revenue Service hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes, and their supposedly historic family estate in Connecticut was heavily mortgaged and currently sitting on the absolute brink of foreclosure. But the financial ruin did not stop with the parents. Spencer Kensington, the man my sister believed was her golden ticket to elite society, was drowning in a spectacular amount of personal debt. The background check revealed that Spencer had over $250,000 in outstanding credit card debt spread across multiple high-interest limit cards. His banking history was a complete disaster class in financial mismanagement. He had poured whatever remaining cash he could scrape together into a series of highly volatile cryptocurrency investments over the past 3 years. He had bought high and sold low repeatedly chasing digital trends, and he had lost absolutely everything. His investment portfolio was completely wiped out. The man who wore custom-tailored tuxedos and looked down his nose at my honest property management work was essentially living on borrowed time and borrowed money. I scrolled through the pages of the legal dossier, marveling at the pure, undeniable irony of the situation. I suddenly realized the full twisted truth of this entire wedding spectacle. Spencer was not marrying Jada because he loved her, or because she fit seamlessly into his elite social circle. He was marrying Jada because he honestly believed she was a wealthy socialite who could save him from ruin. I opened a new tab on my web browser and navigated to my sister's public social media profile. Jada had spent the last 5 years aggressively cultivating the image of an ultra-wealthy jet-setting influencer. I looked closely at her most popular and highly engaged photos. There she was posing by a stunning infinity pool in Miami, wearing designer sunglasses. There was another photo of her sipping expensive champagne on a sprawling penthouse balcony overlooking the New York City skyline. Another post showed her walking gracefully down the grand sweeping staircase of a massive luxury cabin in Aspen, Colorado. I shook my head in pure disbelief as the puzzle pieces finally snapped perfectly together. Every single one of those luxury properties where Jada took her glamorous photos belonged to me. They were all part of the Vanguard Holdings real estate portfolio. Whenever I had a new luxury property finalized and ready for the rental market, Jada would beg me to let her visit for just a few hours to take photos for her brand development. She never once tagged my company or acknowledged that I owned the properties. She carefully framed every single image and wrote vague captions to make it look like she was the one who owned them, or at least had the vast financial means to rent them exclusively for herself. She had built her entire online persona using my hard-earned assets as her personal movie set. Spencer must have seen her profile, seen the sprawling estates and the penthouses, and assumed she was sitting on a massive family fortune. He thought he had found a wealthy black woman who was so desperate for white validation and high society access that she would gladly fund his lavish lifestyle and bail his family out of their impending financial ruin. And Jada thought she had found a wealthy white man from a prominent family who would elevate her social status and fund her endless designer shopping sprees for the rest of her life. It was a spectacular mutual scam. Two completely broke, deeply superficial con artists were actively trying to mine gold from each other. They were both desperately trying to secure a bag that simply did not exist. The poetic justice of it all was so profound that I almost felt a brief passing moment of pity for them. I tried to imagine the sheer terror Jada would feel when Spencer inevitably came to her begging for cash to cover the venue, assuming she could just dip into her vast real estate fortune. She would have absolutely nothing to give him. But then I remembered Caroline making racist comments about my catering staff calling their service ghetto. I remembered my father Calvin demanding I pay $15,000 for a string quartet so we would not look poor in front of a family that was actually entirely broke. The pity vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. It was exactly 48 hours until the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin at the Vanguard estate. The massive floral arrangements were supposed to be delivered the next morning. The luxury reception tents were scheduled to be erected on the Great Lawn. The catering staff was busy prepping a 5-course menu for over 300 guests, and the groom had just bounced a check for $100,000. I picked up my phone and called Elias. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and highly professional. I asked him for a complete status update on the estate preparations. He informed me that everything was proceeding exactly on schedule and that the Kensington setup crew was slated to arrive early the next morning to begin the final staging. I told Elias that there had been a very significant change of plans. I instructed him to formally notify Spencer Kensington that the final cashier check had bounced. I told him to make it very clear that the Vanguard estate operates on a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding finances. No payment means no venue. I wanted Elias to deliver the news exactly 48 hours before the event, ensuring that Spencer would be thrown into a state of absolute maximum panic with no time to secure an alternative location. Elias did not ask any unnecessary questions. He simply agreed to carry out the directive immediately. I knew I could trust him to handle the situation with the perfect amount of cold corporate detachment. I spent the next 2 hours sitting on my private lanai, listening to the ocean waves and waiting for the inevitable fallout. I did not have to wait long. Later that afternoon, Elias sent me a detailed, secure message updating me on the situation. According to Elias' detailed report, Spencer Kensington had received the notification about the bounced check and completely lost his mind. Less than an hour after receiving the email, Spencer stormed into the Vanguard Estate main management office. Elias described him as sweating profusely, his face red with panic and absolute rage. Spencer demanded to know why his payment had been rejected, acting as though it must have been a simple banking error or a glitch in the Vanguard accounting system. Elias, maintaining his absolute composure, simply slid the return check across the heavy mahogany desk. He informed Spencer that the bank had explicitly cited insufficient funds as the reason for the rejection. Spencer immediately went on the defensive. He puffed out his chest and tried to use pure intimidation tactics. He started yelling at Elias, demanding respect and threatening him with his supposed high society connections. He claimed his family had powerful lawyers on retainer and that he would sue the Vanguard estate for breach of contract and severe emotional distress. He threw around his family name as if it were a magical key that could unlock any door. I thought he could bully an employee into overlooking a $100,000 deficit simply by leveraging his white privilege and his fake old money status. He yelled that Elias was making a massive mistake and that the Kensingtons would completely ruin the reputation of the venue if they were not accommodated immediately. He demanded that the heavy iron gates remain open and that the setup crew be allowed onto the property the next morning as planned, promising that the funds would magically appear from a trust account after the weekend was over. Elias, of course, did not flinch. He had worked in luxury estate management for decades and had dealt with plenty of arrogant, entitled clients whose bank accounts did not match their aggressive attitudes. Elias simply looked at Spencer, the bounced check, resting on the pristine desk between them. He did not raise his voice or match Spencer's erratic, desperate energy. He delivered the ultimatum exactly as I had instructed him to do. Elias calmly placed his hands on the desk, looked Spencer directly in the eye, and issued the final warning. Cash by 5 o'clock tomorrow evening, Mr. Kensington, or the gates stay locked. The sheer finality of that statement must have hit Spencer like a physical blow to the chest. There were no negotiations to be had. There were no elite connections that could save him from basic accounting principles. He needed to produce $100,000 in pure liquid cash in less than 24 hours or the most important social event of his life. The wedding that was supposed to save his family from public embarrassment would be completely canceled and the doors literally barred. I read the end of Elias' report and felt a deep, satisfying thrill coursing through my veins. The trap was set perfectly. I knew for an absolute fact that Spencer did not have the cash anywhere. I knew his parents did not have the cash. And I knew that my sister Jada and my enabling father Calvin certainly did not have the cash to bail him out. The walls were closing in on all of them simultaneously. They were about to experience the exact kind of devastating public humiliation they had so casually tried to inflict upon me. I closed my laptop, picked up my glass of pineapple juice, and walked to the edge of the balcony, letting the warm breeze surround me. Tomorrow, the great iron gates of the Vanguard estate would lock tight and the real show would finally begin. The next morning arrived with a gentle ocean breeze sweeping through my private villa. I had scheduled an intensive 2-hour hot stone massage at the resort spa to ensure I remained completely relaxed while the absolute chaos unfolded back in Atlanta. I lay face down on a plush heated massage table, listening to the soothing sound of traditional Hawaiian instrumental music playing softly in the background. The massage therapist applied warm, fragrant coconut oil to my shoulders, working out the minor tension I had carried for years while dealing with my deeply toxic family. As the heated stones were placed carefully along my spine, my phone began to vibrate relentlessly on the small bamboo table next to me. The screen lit up over and over again, illuminating the dim, tranquil room with a frantic energy that felt entirely foreign to my current peaceful state of mind. I knew exactly who was trying to reach me. Jada had finally received the catastrophic news from her allegedly wealthy fiancé. Spencer must have been forced to confess that the venue was demanding a massive cash payment and that his accounts were entirely empty. I did not reach for the phone immediately. I simply let it vibrate against the bamboo wood, allowing my sister to sit in her escalating panic. For my entire life, Jada had demanded instant responses and immediate accommodations from everyone around her. She expected me to drop whatever I was doing to cater to her latest manufactured crisis. Not today. I took a deep, slow breath and focused entirely on the soothing heat of the stones against my skin. After the massage therapist finished her exceptional work, she quietly left the room, allowing me a few moments of privacy. I sat up, wrapped myself in a thick white cotton robe, and finally picked up my device. There were 37 new text messages and 14 missed calls, all from Jada. I walked out to the private spa courtyard, where an attendant handed me a chilled mimosa made with freshly squeezed orange juice. I sat on a woven lounge chair, took a slow, deliberate sip of the sweet champagne cocktail, and opened the message thread. The progression of Jada texts was a masterclass in manipulation and pure desperation. The first few messages attempted to sound casual and breezy, as if she were simply reaching out to catch up. She wrote that she missed me terribly and felt so incredibly guilty about how things ended at the bridal boutique. She said she had been thinking about our sisterhood and how much she wanted me to be part of her special day, despite the minor disagreements we had earlier in the week. It was a pathetic attempt to reel me back in using fake affection. When I did not respond, her tone quickly shifted from fake sweetness to naked urgency. She sent a long, rambling paragraph explaining that there had been a tiny clerical error with Spencer Banking Institution. She claimed his massive trust fund transfer had been temporarily frozen due to an international security flag, and that the wedding venue was being completely unreasonable about the final deposit. Then came the ultimate request. Jada asked if I could do her a huge monumental favor and lend her my Black American Express card just for 24 hours to cover a minor wedding emergency. She promised that Spencer would wire me the funds with interest the moment his accounts were unfrozen on Monday morning. I stared at the screen, reading her request to borrow my credit card to pay for a venue that I already owned. The absolute delusion was staggering. She still believed I was just a financially struggling property manager, yet she was perfectly willing to put me in massive debt to save her own social standing. I took another slow sip of my mimosa, enjoying the crisp citrus flavor. I did not type a single word in response. I simply left the message status on read, knowing that the little blue indicator would show her that I had seen her desperate plea and actively chosen to ignore it. A few minutes later, a new notification popped up. This time it was a voicemail from my mother, Yvonne. I pressed play and held the phone to my ear. Yvonne's voice was shrill and vibrating with pure, unfiltered anger. She screamed into the receiver, demanding to know why I was ignoring my sister during her hour of need. She yelled that Jada was currently having a severe panic attack in the middle of their living room because the venue was threatening to cancel the entire event over a simple banking delay. Yvonne called me a bitter, jealous woman who was intentionally trying to punish her sister out of pure spite. She commanded me to pick up the phone, call Jada back, and provide my credit card information immediately to save the family from public embarrassment. She ended the voicemail by stating that if I did not comply, I would be permanently dead to her. I deleted the voicemail with a single tap of my finger. They had already made it explicitly clear that I was not welcome in their family, so her threats of disownment meant absolutely nothing to me now. They were drowning in the shallow waters of their own superficial priorities, and I refused to throw them a life preserver. Later that afternoon, I returned to my oceanfront suite and opened my secure corporate laptop to review my daily briefings. Elias, my meticulous estate manager at Vanguard, sent an urgent priority message requesting a brief video conference. I initiated the call, and Elias appeared on the screen, sitting in his pristine office at the estate. He maintained his usual calm and professional demeanor, but I could tell he was deeply amused by the ongoing situation. Elias informed me that Spencer Kensington had returned to the management office about an hour ago. Spencer had not brought a cashier check or the required physical cash. Instead, he slid a printed document across the desk, claiming it was an expedited federal wire transfer confirmation from his primary wealth management institution. Elias explained that Spencer was sweating profusely, and his hands were shaking as he presented the paper. He confidently demanded that Elias accept the document as concrete proof of payment and open the heavy iron gates immediately so the luxury rental company could begin erecting the massive reception tents on the Great Lawn. Elias held the document up to the camera so I could examine it. It was supposed to be a standard Swift wire transfer receipt, but even from a distance I could see the glaring errors. I instructed Elias to scan the document and send it to my secure email for a closer inspection. Within seconds, the high-resolution file appeared on my screen. I zoomed in on the banking details and a cold, hard laugh escaped my lips. It was a completely fraudulent document. Spencer had clearly used basic photo editing software to alter an old bank statement. The transaction routing numbers did not match standard Federal Reserve formatting, and the font used for the monetary amount was slightly different from the rest of the text on the page. The margins were misaligned, and the digital signature at the bottom was noticeably pixelated. The great Spencer Kensington, the man who claimed to come from generations of untouchable white wealth, had resorted to cheap digital forgery to steal services from my company. He was committing blatant wire fraud, a serious federal offense, just to maintain the illusion that he was a wealthy high society groom. I asked Elias how he had responded to the forged document. Elias told me he had reviewed the paper carefully, looked Spencer directly in the eyes, and informed him that the Vanguard Estate Financial Department would need to verify the transfer with the issuing bank before any access could be granted. He said Spencer immediately became defensive, yelling that the document was completely legitimate and accusing Elias of being deliberately uncooperative. Spencer threatened to have his family lawyers sue the estate for emotional distress and breach of verbal contract. I smiled at the sheer desperation of a man who was out of money, out of time, and completely out of his depth. I leaned back in my chair and considered my options very carefully. I could have instructed Elias to call the local authorities immediately and have Spencer arrested for attempting to pass fraudulent financial documents. It would have been swift and legally justified. But an immediate quiet arrest would not deliver the profound public reckoning my family deserved. If the event was cancelled today, Jada and Yvonne would simply invent a convenient lie to tell their guests. They would claim the venue had an unexpected plumbing emergency or a sudden structural failure. They would play the victims and garner sympathy from their shallow social circle. I needed the truth to be exposed in the most undeniable and spectacular way possible. I needed the guests to arrive expecting a royal wedding and instead find a crime scene. I needed the Kensington family fake wealth to be laid bare for everyone to see. I gave Elias a new set of highly specific instructions. I told him to accept the forged document conditionally. I instructed him to tell Spencer that the Vanguard estate would grant access to the setup crews and allow the event to proceed under the assumption that the wire transfer would officially clear the next morning. I wanted Elias to play along just enough to give Spencer a false sense of absolute security. By accepting the fraudulent document conditionally, we were giving them enough rope to hang themselves completely. The vendors would arrive, the floral arrangements would be placed, and the entire extravagant setup would be completed. Jada and Yvonne would sleep soundly, thinking they had successfully secured their high society future. And then, right as the ceremony was scheduled to begin, we would drop the hammer. Elias understood the strategy perfectly. He agreed to inform the security team to let the vendors through the service entrance and allow the preparations to begin. He promised to ensure that the main iron gates remained locked until the actual guest arrival time. The following day, maximizing the dramatic impact of our final move. I thanked Elias for his exceptional service and ended the video call. The trap was now fully and permanently set. The massive, intricate web of lies that my mother, my sister, and the Kensington family had woven was about to snap under its own tremendous weight. The suffocating anxiety that usually accompanied any involvement with my family was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, exhilarating sense of impending justice. The next morning dawned bright and clear. It was Saturday. The day of the grand wedding had finally arrived. I woke up early, ordered a delicious light breakfast, and went for a long, peaceful walk along the beautiful shoreline. By noon, I returned to my luxury suite and prepared my workstation. I sat on the edge of my woven lounge chair with my secure laptop resting carefully on my knees. The warm morning sun of Hawaii bathed my skin, but my entire focus was locked on the digital screen in front of me. The live security camera feed from the Vanguard estate provided a crystal-clear, high-definition view of the massive wrought iron gates that marked the main entrance to my property. Usually, these grand gates would stand wide open on a Saturday afternoon to welcome guests into the sprawling botanical gardens. Today, however, they were pulled tightly shut and secured with thick, heavy industrial chains. 4 armed sheriff deputies stood in a perfectly straight line across the cobblestone driveway. Their official patrol vehicles were parked horizontally, completely blocking any possible entry. I watched as the first wave of luxury vehicles began to pull up to the estate. Sleek black town cars and expensive imported sedans formed a long, chaotic line down the rural highway. The guests were arriving for what they fully believed would be the social event of the season. Women in vibrant silk gowns and men in tailored summer suits stepped out of their vehicles looking deeply confused as they approached the barricade. They clustered together in small groups, whispering and pointing at the armed officers. I took a slow sip of my mimosa and adjusted the volume on my computer. Elias had strategically placed hidden microphones near the gate intercom system so I could hear every single word that was about to be spoken. The tension on the screen escalated rapidly when a massive white limousine pulled up to the front of the line. The rear door swung open and Spencer Kensington stepped out. He was wearing a custom white tuxedo jacket, but he did not look like a wealthy groom ready to celebrate his high society wedding. He looked completely unhinged. His face was flushed dark red and sweat was pouring down his forehead, staining the stiff white collar of his dress shirt. He marched directly up to the line of sheriff deputies, waving his arms frantically. He began shouting at them, demanding that they open the gates immediately. He puffed out his chest and tried to use his perceived authority, telling the officers that his family had powerful connections and that they were ruining a private elite event. The deputies did not flinch. They stood their ground with absolute stoicism. One of the officers held up a hand and told Spencer to step back from the barricade. Spencer refused to listen. He continued to scream that there had been a massive banking error and that he had every legal right to access the property. He looked absolutely pathetic, trying to assert dominance while standing on the wrong side of a locked fence. A few moments later, a second limousine arrived carrying the bridal party. Jada stepped out of the vehicle wearing a massive designer wedding gown covered in intricate lace and heavy crystal beadwork. She was followed closely by my mother Yvonne and my father Calvin. They all rushed toward the gates, their faces twisting into expressions of pure horror as they took in the scene. Jada pushed her way through the growing crowd of confused guests, her heavy dress dragging across the dirty asphalt. She grabbed Spencer by the arm and demanded to know what was happening. She looked around at the armed officers and the locked gates with wild, frantic eyes. Yvonne stepped forward and attempted to scold the deputies. She told them they were making a terrible mistake and that they were embarrassing a very prominent family. Calvin stood slightly behind them, trying to look dignified, but failing miserably as the crowd of onlookers began to pull out their cell phones. The guests were realizing that this was not a simple logistical delay. They were witnessing a spectacular public disaster, and they wanted to document every single second of it. I watched my sister look at the heavy chains on the gate, and I could see the exact moment the panic truly settled into her bones. The head sheriff deputy took a step forward and raised his voice so that it carried over the murmur of the crowd. He looked directly at Spencer and spoke with absolute authority. He stated clearly that he was addressing Mr. Spencer Kensington. The deputy announced that the legal owners of the Vanguard estate had filed an official trespassing injunction against him. He continued speaking, his voice echoing across the driveway. He stated that Spencer had submitted a fraudulent wire transfer document and that his final cashier check for $100,000 had been returned by the bank due to insufficient funds. The deputy told him that any attempt to enter the property would result in his immediate arrest for trespassing and wire fraud. The entire crowd of over 300 guests went completely silent. The only sound was the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees and the soft clicking of hundreds of cell phone cameras recording the scene. The words fraudulent wire transfer and insufficient funds hung in the warm afternoon air like a thick, heavy fog. Everyone heard it. The snobby country club friends of the Kensington family heard it. The shallow social media influencers that Jada had invited heard it. The ultimate truth was finally out in the open. The great Spencer Kensington, the man who claimed to come from generations of untouchable wealth, was completely broke and under investigation for fraud. The silence was abruptly shattered by a shrill, furious scream. Caroline Kensington, the sister of Spencer, pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Her face was contorted with absolute rage. She did not direct her anger at her brother who had committed the fraud. Instead, she turned entirely on my sister Jada. Caroline pointed a shaking finger directly at Jada and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She called Jada a broke ghetto gold digger. She yelled that Jada and her family had promised to pay for the venue and the catering. She accused Jada of lying about her real estate wealth to trap her brother into marriage. The racist and classist insults flowed from the mouth of Caroline without any restraint. Jada stood frozen in her massive wedding dress, completely unable to process the verbal assault. But my mother Yvonne was not going to remain silent. Yvonne lunged forward and screamed right back at Caroline. Yvonne yelled that Spencer had promised his massive trust fund was covering all the expenses. She screamed that the Kensington family were the real frauds, and that they had lied about their historic wealth to take advantage of her beautiful daughter. I sat on my lanai in Hawaii, watching the two families scream at each other on my computer screen, and I felt a profound sense of poetic justice. The beautiful mutual scam was fully unraveling right before my eyes. Jada and Yvonne suddenly realized that there was no old money trust fund waiting for them. Spencer and Caroline suddenly realized that Jada did not own a massive portfolio of luxury real estate properties. They had both been aggressively trying to scam each other, and now they were both standing on the side of a rural highway completely destitute and publicly humiliated. The wedding guests were gasping and whispering among themselves. Some were laughing openly at the sheer absurdity of the situation. Jada started to cry, sobbing heavily, as her perfect influencer aesthetic was dragged through the mud. She turned to Spencer, begging him to tell her it was a lie, begging him to fix the situation. Spencer just stared at the ground, completely defeated. He had no money and no power to save her. Calvin stood silently in the background, looking absolutely foolish in his rented tuxedo. He had demanded $15,000 from me to impress a family that could not even afford to pay for their own event venue. Just when I thought the scene could not possibly get any more dramatic, the heavy wooden front doors of the Vanguard Estate Management office opened. Elias, my meticulous estate manager, walked slowly and purposefully down the long cobblestone driveway toward the locked iron gates. He was dressed in a pristine gray suit, and he carried a red and white megaphone in his right hand. The crowd of arguing family members and shocked guests slowly quieted down as they watched him approach. Elias stopped a few feet away from the iron barricade and raised the megaphone to his mouth. He did not look angry or upset. He looked completely serene and professional as he carried out his final directive. I turned up the volume on my laptop to ensure I heard every single word of his delivery. Elias spoke clearly, and his amplified voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade. He stated that he was the general manager of the estate, and that he had been instructed to deliver a personal message directly from the true owner of the property. He paused for a brief moment, allowing the anticipation to build among the massive crowd. Then he continued. He stated that the actual owner of the Vanguard estate wanted to pass along her sincerest regards. Elias said that Miss Alia hoped they all would enjoy their day, but that they absolutely could not do it on her property. He lowered the megaphone and stood silently behind the locked gates, watching the devastation unfold. The impact of that single name hitting the crowd was catastrophic. The name Aaliyah echoed through the air and struck my family like a physical blow. Yvonne gasped, placing both hands over her mouth as her eyes widened in pure terror. Calvin stumbled backward as if all the strength had suddenly left his legs. And Jada, my sister, who had texted me just a few days ago to say that my natural hair and my property management job were too embarrassing to be associated with her elite wedding, completely gave out. Jada collapsed to her knees right there on the dirty asphalt. Her massive, heavy lace wedding gown pooled around her in the dust, completely ruined by the dirt and the grime of the road. She covered her face with her hands and began to wail loudly, her cries of despair echoing through the crowd of guests who were busy recording her absolute downfall. She finally realized the staggering magnitude of her terrible mistake. The sister she had so casually thrown away was the very same woman who owned the $20 million estate she was begging to enter. I watched the live video feed, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, just so they could feel powerful. They had constantly chosen the validation of racist strangers over the love and loyalty of their own blood. Now they were left with nothing but the reality of their own shallow choices. The guests who had dressed up in their finest clothes were now slowly turning around and walking back to their vehicles, shaking their heads in sheer disbelief. The great wedding event of the year had become the ultimate social disaster. I reached over to the small table and picked up my glass of pineapple juice and champagne. I raised the glass slightly toward the computer screen, offering a final silent toast to the success of my trap. The warm Hawaiian sun continued to shine down on me, and the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the beach filled the air with absolute peace. I closed my laptop and placed it gently on the table. The show was over for now. The Vanguard estate gates remained firmly locked, and the people who had told me I did not belong were left completely outside in the cold, hard truth of the real world. The live video feed from the Vanguard estate finally faded into a static screen as Elias formally disconnected the security cameras. I sat in the profound silence of my Hawaiian villa and allowed the absolute magnitude of what had just occurred to wash over me. For my entire life, I had been told that I was the problem. I had been conditioned to believe that my dark skin, my natural hair, and my quiet success were somehow an embarrassment to a family that only valued proximity to white wealth. Today, I had completely dismantled their deeply toxic illusion without ever raising my voice or leaving my comfortable lounge chair. My encrypted work tablet sat quietly on the glass table, but my personal cell phone was telling an entirely different story. I had unblocked my family members earlier in the morning specifically to monitor their reactions when the gates remained locked. Now the device was vibrating so violently against the bamboo table that it threatened to slide right off the edge and shatter on the stone patio. I picked up the phone and looked at the lock screen. The digital notification counter displayed 199 missed calls. There were over 400 unread text messages flooding my inbox in a chaotic, relentless stream of pure desperation and rage. I opened the message thread from my sister Jada first. The progression of her texts mirrored the 5 stages of grief perfectly. Her initial messages sent right after the sheriff deputies announced the fraudulent wire transfer were full of blatant denial. She demanded that I call the security team and fix the terrible misunderstanding. 10 minutes later, the denial morphed into intense bargaining. She begged me to just open the heavy iron gates for the afternoon, promising that Spencer would sign over his entire imaginary trust fund to compensate me. When Elias delivered my final message through the megaphone, her tone shifted to absolute panic and raw fury. Jada typed in all capital letters, screaming through the digital screen that her life was completely ruined. She said her perfect influencer image was destroyed and that she would be the laughingstock of the entire elite social community in Atlanta. She begged me to please tell them to open the gates, claiming she would do anything I wanted if I just saved her from this massive public humiliation. I swiped out of Jada thread and opened the messages from my mother, Yvonne. Yvonne did not bother with bargaining or begging. Her texts were dripping with the toxic entitlement and aggressive victimhood she had weaponized against me since childhood. She demanded to know how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. She accused me of being a deeply vindictive and sociopathic woman who derived sick pleasure from torturing her own family. Yvonne typed that I had intentionally humiliated them in front of high society and that I was a complete disgrace to the family name. She said she always knew my independence would lead to something sinister, and that my wealth had turned me into a cold, heartless monster. I read her vicious words and felt absolutely nothing. The woman who had told me to shrink my blackness to secure a white man approval was now furious that I had used my own massive success to expose a white man fraud. The most surprising messages came from an unknown number that I quickly identified as Caroline Kensington. Spencer, racist and highly entitled sister, had apparently bullied my contact information out of Jada during the absolute chaos in the driveway. Caroline messages were frantic, unhinged, and deeply offensive. She called me and my family a group of broke ghetto scammers who had intentionally tricked her innocent brother into a fake marriage. She typed that we people were a complete disgrace to civil society and that the Kensington family would be filing massive lawsuits against all of us for emotional distress and public defamation. I found it incredibly hilarious that Caroline was threatening legal action while her own brother had just been publicly outed for submitting a forged federal wire document. I deleted Caroline messages without a second thought. I set the phone down and walked over to the small kitchenette in my suite. I prepared myself a large bowl of fresh ahi tuna, poke mixing the raw fish with sweet onions, sesame oil, and a touch of spicy soy sauce. I took my meal back out to the lanai and sat down under the warm afternoon sun. I opened a popular social media application on my phone to see if the fallout had reached the public sphere yet. I did not even have to search for it. The algorithm had already picked up on the massive trending drama. Guests who had been locked out of the Vanguard estate had immediately started posting live videos and commentary directly from the rural highway outside my property. The hashtags related to the failed wedding were already going incredibly viral. I tapped on a video that had already accumulated over 2 million views. The footage was shaky, but the audio was crystal clear. It showed Jada and Caroline Kensington standing in the dust of the road surrounded by the idling luxury limousines. The argument between them had escalated from verbal insults to a full physical altercation. In the video, Caroline lunged forward and grabbed a handful of the intricate lace on Jada's expensive wedding gown, attempting to rip it. Jada retaliated by swinging her heavy bridal bouquet directly at Caroline's face, striking her in the cheek with a bundle of white roses. The two women were screaming obscenities at each other, while Spencer stood completely frozen in the background, sweating through his ruined custom tuxedo. My mother Yvonne could be seen in the periphery desperately trying to pull Jada back, while yelling that someone needed to call a lawyer. The guest who was filming the video provided a hilarious running commentary, mocking the supposed high society families for brawling in the dirt, like cast members on a cheap reality television show. I watched the video 3 times, eating my fresh poke and savoring the absolute destruction of their carefully curated aesthetic. Jada had spent years making me feel like an uncultured embarrassment because I preferred to focus on my business rather than elite social climbing. Now she was the star of a viral internet brawl, wearing a dirt-stained wedding dress and fighting with a woman who had openly called our people ghetto just 24 hours earlier. It was the purest form of poetic justice. As I finished my meal, another notification popped up on my phone. This one was not a text message or a social media alert. It was a high-priority security notification from the Primary Fraud Detection Department of my elite banking institution. I frowned and opened the secure banking application to review the alert. Someone was actively trying to run 3 of my corporate credit cards for a massive unauthorized transaction. I clicked on the details and saw that the attempted charges were originating from a mid-tier hotel banquet hall in downtown Atlanta. The total amount being requested was $45,000. I immediately understood exactly what was happening. Jada, having been completely locked out of the Vanguard estate and publicly humiliated, was desperately trying to salvage her wedding day by securing a cheap emergency backup venue for a makeshift reception. And because Spencer accounts were completely empty and Calvin was completely broke, she had resorted to full-blown identity theft. Jada had somehow memorized or copied the numbers from my corporate American Express cards during one of her previous visits to my home. She was trying to charge $45,000 in my name to pay for a banquet hall to feed the few guests who had not already fled the scene in sheer disgust. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her actions took my breath away for a brief moment. She had literally just texted me an hour ago to borrow a card for a minor emergency. When I ignored her, she decided to simply steal my financial information and commit a massive federal felony. She truly believed that because we shared the same blood, she was completely entitled to my hard-earned wealth, regardless of how horribly she treated me. She thought I would just pay the credit card bill later to avoid creating a family scandal. I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed the prominent red button on my banking application that read Report Fraud. I confirmed that the attempted $45,000 transaction was completely unauthorized, and I instructed the bank to immediately cancel all 3 compromised credit cards. The application generated a digital fraud report, which I instantly forwarded to my corporate legal team. I added a brief note instructing them to compile all the evidence of this attempted identity theft. Jada had just handed me the absolute ultimate weapon to ensure she would never be able to manipulate or steal from me again. I was not going to protect her from the severe legal consequences of her desperate criminal actions. The Hawaiian sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a beautiful golden glow across the ocean water. I felt a profound sense of closure. The entire toxic structure of my family had been completely dismantled in a single afternoon. I picked up my phone to check my messages one last time before turning it off for the evening. A new text message had just arrived from my father Calvin. I opened the thread expecting more demands for money or more enabling excuses for Jada criminal behavior. Calvin's message was short, sharp, and dripping with the arrogant authority he always tried to exert over me. He wrote that I had completely destroyed this family. He stated that Spencer was currently being actively investigated by the local police for the fraudulent wire transfer, and that the Kensington family was threatening to sue Calvin personally for the travel expenses. He ordered me to come home right now and fix this massive disaster. He ended the message with a final pathetic ultimatum. He typed that if I did not return immediately and pay to resolve the situation, I would be permanently dead to them. I stared at the threatening message from the man who was supposed to be my father. He still did not understand the reality of the situation. He still thought he held some kind of patriarchal power over me. He thought he could command me to return to Atlanta and clean up the spectacular mess that he and my mother had allowed Jada to create. He honestly believed that the threat of being dead to the family was a punishment, rather than the exact liberation I had been seeking my entire life. I smiled and typed my final response to him. My fingers moved quickly and deliberately across the digital keyboard. Booking my flight. See you tomorrow. Gather everyone in the living room. I hit send and locked the phone. I was indeed going back to Atlanta, but I was not going back to fix anything for them. I was going back to deliver the final absolute death blow to their grand illusions. They thought the locked gates at the Vanguard estate were the worst thing that could possibly happen to them. They had absolutely no idea that I held one final card in my hand. A card so devastating that it would completely obliterate any remaining shred of pride or dignity my parents had left. The true reckoning was not over. It was just moving from my commercial property directly into their personal living room. I walked back inside my villa and opened my travel application to book a return flight to the mainland. The vacation was officially over, but the absolute ultimate victory was just beginning. I packed my single suitcase with the exact same calm precision I had used when I left. I was returning home, not as the scapegoat daughter, but as the undeniable architect of their complete and total destruction. The flight from Hawaii back to Atlanta felt incredibly short compared to the long years I had spent waiting for this exact moment. I sat in my first-class seat and reviewed the massive black binder my legal team had prepared for me. David, my chief legal counsel, had compiled every single piece of financial evidence proving that the Kensington family was completely destitute. I traced my fingers over the smooth leather cover of the binder, knowing that the pages inside held the absolute power to destroy the racist, classist hierarchy my parents worshipped. When the plane finally touched down on the tarmac, I felt a surge of cold and calculating energy coursing through my veins. I bypassed the baggage claim entirely since I had only brought a single carry-on suitcase. I walked out of the terminal and found my private transportation waiting at the curb. I had arranged for a specialized executive protection agent to accompany me to my parents' house. His name was Isaiah, and he was a massive, highly trained professional who understood that his primary job today was to ensure my absolute physical safety during the impending confrontation. I handed Isaiah my luggage and slid into the back seat of the dark-tinted sport utility vehicle. The drive through the affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta felt surreal. I looked out the window at the sprawling mansions and manicured lawns, remembering how my mother Yvonne used to point at these houses and tell me I would never be good enough to live in one. She truly believed that my dark skin and natural hair disqualified me from luxury. She was about to learn that I did not just live in luxury, I owned the companies that built it. We pulled into the long, circular driveway of my parents' house. The property looked exactly as it always did, but the atmosphere surrounding it felt incredibly toxic. There were multiple cars parked haphazardly across the front lawn, indicating that the entire disastrous wedding party had retreated here after being completely locked out of the Vanguard estate. I stepped out of the vehicle and instructed Isaiah to follow closely behind me. I did not bother knocking on the heavy oak front door. I simply turned the brass handle and walked right into the middle of the absolute wreckage. The scene in the main living room was a spectacular masterpiece of pure misery. The air was thick with the smell of stale alcohol and sheer desperation. My sister Jada was curled into a tight ball on the expensive white velvet sofa. She was no longer wearing the heavy, intricate lace wedding gown that she had dragged through the dirt outside my property. She was dressed in a pair of oversized gray sweatpants and a stained hooded sweatshirt. Her perfectly curated influencer makeup was completely washed away by hours of relentless sobbing, leaving her face puffy and red. Spencer Kensington was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor like a trapped animal. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket was thrown carelessly over a dining chair, and his expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He looked disheveled and completely out of his depth. My mother, Yvonne, and my father, Calvin, were sitting in matching armchairs, glaring at the floor with expressions of pure defeat. And bizarrely sitting in the corner of the room was Spencer Race's sister, Caroline. She was sipping a glass of cheap wine and looking around the room with an expression of intense disdain, as if she were somehow the ultimate victim of this entire situation. The moment I stepped into the living room, the heavy silence shattered into a million pieces. Yvonne jumped out of her armchair, her eyes wide with shock and absolute fury. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and launched into a vicious and unhinged tirade. She screamed that I was a vindictive and sociopathic monster who had intentionally humiliated my own sister in front of white high society. Yvonne yelled that if I truly owned the Vanguard estate, I should have given it to Jada for free to ensure the family secured their place among the wealthy elite. She accused me of being a bitter and jealous woman who derived sick pleasure from ruining the most important day of Jada life. Calvin stood up and joined the verbal assault. He demanded to know how I could be so cruel and heartless to my own flesh and blood. He said I had completely destroyed their reputation in the community and that the Kensington family was demanding massive financial restitution for the severe emotional distress I had caused them. Jada uncurled herself from the sofa and began wailing loudly, claiming that her entire social media career was permanently over and that she would never be able to show her face in public again. Caroline Kensington set her wine glass down on a side table and stood up. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. Caroline demanded that I immediately reimburse her family for the expensive flights they took to attend the wedding. She said her family was incredibly prominent, and that they would not tolerate being publicly humiliated by a group of broke, desperate scammers. She threatened to unleash her family, powerful legal team on my real estate company and completely ruin my professional reputation. I stood in the center of the living room flanked by my massive security guard Isaiah and simply let them yell. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a single apology or explanation for my actions. I waited patiently for them to completely exhaust themselves. When their screams finally died down into heavy panting and pathetic sobs, I slowly walked over to the large glass coffee table in the center of the room. I unclasped my briefcase and pulled out the thick black binder that David had prepared for me. I lifted it high into the air and let it drop directly onto the glass surface with a loud, authoritative thud that made everyone in the room flinch. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and spoke with a voice as cold and hard as solid ice. I told Yvonne that she had spent my entire life telling me I was not good enough for high society. I told her she had begged and scraped and sacrificed her own dignity just to impress the people standing in this very room. I gestured toward Spencer and Caroline, who were both watching me with growing expressions of dread. I told my parents that they wanted to impress old money high society so badly that they were willing to throw their own daughter away. I looked at the black binder resting on the glass table. I told them we should take a very close look at exactly who they were trying to impress. I reached down and flipped open the heavy leather cover of the binder. The first page displayed a comprehensive summary of the Kensington family financial ruin. I did not rush the delivery. I wanted every single word to land like a physical blow. I looked at Spencer and began reading his devastating reality aloud for the entire room to hear. I read the official court documents detailing the massive federal tax liens filed against his parents by the Internal Revenue Service. I read the foreclosure notices slapped on their supposedly historic family estate in Connecticut. I turned the page and read the detailed reports of Spencer's catastrophic personal finances. I listed the exact amounts of his staggering credit card debt spread across multiple high-interest accounts. I read the aggressive collection notices from his unpaid luxury car loans. I detailed the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had completely lost chasing volatile and foolish cryptocurrency investments. I read the eviction warning from his luxury apartment complex, highlighting that he had not paid his rent in over 6 months. I made sure to enunciate every single dollar amount, projecting my voice so that the staggering numbers echoed off the walls of my parents' house. I wanted them to hear exactly how worthless the man they had chosen over me truly was. As I read the undeniable financial facts, the atmosphere in the living room shifted from toxic rage to absolute pure horror. Yvonne's face drained of all color as she slowly realized that the wealthy white family she worshipped was actually entirely destitute. Calvin sank back into his armchair, his mouth hanging slightly open as he processed the fact that he had been financially enabling a man who was completely broke. Jada stopped crying and stared at Spencer with wide, terrified eyes. She had thrown me out of her wedding to secure a massive bag of money that simply did not exist. The fake golden ticket she thought she had secured was nothing more than a spectacular mountain of suffocating debt. The beautiful mutual scam had been entirely exposed, and the harsh reality was finally setting in. Caroline Kensington turned deathly pale. The racist arrogance that had fueled her demands for a white catering staff completely evaporated. She realized that I held the absolute undeniable proof of her family financial destruction and that she had absolutely no leverage left. She tried to open her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She simply stood there looking like a pathetic, frightened child whose lies had finally caught up with her. Spencer, however, did not freeze. The public exposure of his massive financial fraud triggered a desperate and completely unhinged reaction. He realized that the wealthy facade he had used to manipulate my family was permanently shattered. He let out a loud, furious yell and lunged forward across the living room. Spencer reached out with both hands, attempting to physically snatch the black binder off the glass coffee table to destroy the evidence. He did not even make it halfway. Before Spencer could lay a single finger on the documents, Isaiah moved with breathtaking speed and precision. My massive security guard stepped firmly between me and the desperate groom. Isaiah planted his feet, grabbed Spencer by the shoulders, and forcefully shoved him backward. Spencer stumbled across the hardwood floor and crashed heavily into the dining chair he had been pacing around earlier. The chair tipped backward, and Spencer fell clumsily to the ground, his custom tuxedo wrinkling around him. Isaiah stood over him, his imposing giant frame projecting an aura of absolute lethal authority. Isaiah told Spencer in a low, dangerous voice that if he attempted to move aggressively toward me one more time, the consequences would be severe and immediate. Spencer scrambled backward across the floor, completely and utterly terrified of the giant man standing over him. He pulled his knees to his chest and stared at the ground, realizing he was entirely powerless. My mother Yvonne began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as she watched the wealthy, sophisticated man she wanted as a son-in-law cowering on the floor like a complete coward. Calvin tried to stand up to intervene, but a single warning look from Isaiah kept him firmly planted in his armchair. Jada buried her face in her hands and began to wail louder than before, mourning the absolute permanent death of her fake high society future. I stood behind the glass table, completely untouched, calm, and entirely unbothered. I looked down at the open binder displaying the truly pathetic truth of the Kensington dynasty. I felt a profound sense of ultimate satisfaction. I had returned to the very house where my trauma began, but I was no longer the victim of their toxic narrative. I was the architect of their complete reckoning. The family that had demanded I remain invisible was now forced to look directly at the immense power I wielded. I slowly turned the page in the binder, preparing to unleash the next devastating wave of truth. The heavy page of the black binder turned with a soft swoosh that sounded like a thunderclap in the completely silent living room. I kept my eyes locked on Jada, who was still curled on the white velvet sofa, sniffling quietly and trying to maintain her fragile victim persona. She wanted everyone in the room to feel sorry for her. She wanted my parents to rush over and comfort her and tell her that I was a monster for ruining her fairy tale. I was not going to allow her to play the victim for a single second longer. I looked down at the new page in my binder and spoke her name. My voice was quiet, but it carried a sharp edge that made Jada flinch and slowly lift her tear-stained face to look at me. I told Jada that we needed to have a very honest conversation about exactly why she had sent me that text message while I was standing in the bridal boutique. I reminded her of the cruel words she had typed. I recited her message perfectly from memory, telling the room how she had claimed my natural hair was too unkempt and my body weight did not fit her pristine wedding aesthetic. I reminded everyone how she had called my property management job an embarrassment to the family name. Jada looked away, unable to meet my eyes, but I did not let her off the hook. I told her that the aesthetic excuse was a beautifully crafted lie designed to mask a much darker and far more pathetic reality. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the sofa, keeping the binder open in my hands. I told Jada that she did not uninvite me because she was worried about my dark skin or my natural hair clashing with her floral arrangements. I told her she uninvited me because she was absolutely terrified of what would happen if I actually walked through the doors of the Vanguard estate. I looked over at Spencer, who was still sitting on the floor, and then back to my sister. I explained to the entire room that Jada had spent the last 2 years telling Spencer and his snobby old money family that she was a wealthy real estate mogul. I told them how she had used my luxury properties as her personal photo studios, pretending that she owned the penthouses and the sprawling mansions I had worked so hard to acquire. Jada began to shake her head weakly, attempting to deny the truth, but she had no voice left to argue. I continued exposing her massive web of lies. I told her that she knew if I showed up to the wedding at the Vanguard estate, the venue management team would immediately recognize me as the chief executive officer of the company. She knew that if I was placed in a room full of her wealthy fake friends, I would eventually be asked about my career, and the truth about my vast real estate portfolio would inevitably come to light. Jada excluded me from the most important day of her life, simply to protect a profound lie she had told to a white man who was secretly just as broke and desperate as she was. Watch the realization wash over my parents' faces. They had believed Jada was marrying into a high society dynasty based on her own charm and sophistication. Now they were learning that their favorite daughter was nothing more than a cheap con artist who had built an entire relationship on stolen valor and fake Instagram posts. But the deception did not stop at fake social media posts and stolen aesthetics. I turned to the next section of my binder and pulled out a stack of banking documents printed on crisp white paper. I slapped the documents down onto the glass coffee table, right next to the evidence of Spencer financial ruin. I told Jada that pretending to own my houses for internet validation was pathetic, but what she did next was a severe federal crime. I pointed to the glowing red fraud alerts provided by my corporate banking institution. I detailed exactly how Jada had tried to run 3 of my corporate American Express cards for $45,000 at a cheap banquet hall in downtown Atlanta just a few hours ago. Yvonne gasped loudly, finally finding her voice to express shock at the massive dollar amount. I did not let my mother interrupt. I told them that the emergency wedding venue charge was just the absolute tip of the iceberg. I pulled out another stack of papers, highlighting fraudulent applications and forged signatures. I explained that my legal team had run a full credit sweep when the fraud alert was triggered. We discovered that Jada had been systematically stealing my identity for months. The detailed statements showed exactly where my stolen money had gone. She had used my social security number to apply for massive lines of credit, to fund her luxury shopping sprees, buying designer handbags, shoes, and expensive vacations. She had forged my signature to obtain elite VIP club memberships around the city, so she could pretend to be a wealthy socialite in front of Caroline Kensington and her racist friends. She had even opened a joint checking account in my name to funnel funds directly into Spencer failing cryptocurrency investments, hoping to silently bail him out before the wedding. The sheer volume of her financial crimes was staggering, and she had executed all of it, while simultaneously telling me I was an embarrassment to the family. Jada began to sob uncontrollably, burying her face in the sofa cushions. She knew she was completely trapped. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I told her that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had not just been a toxic sibling who made me feel terrible about myself. She had become a full-blown criminal who actively tried to ruin my financial standing to serve her own selfish, delusional ambitions. I stood over the table projecting my voice so there was absolutely no room for misunderstanding. I told Jada she was a felon, and that the documents resting on the glass table were enough to send her to a federal prison for a very long time. I stepped back and waited for my parents to finally realize the monster they had raised. I expected Calvin and Yvonne to turn on Jada in sheer horror. I expected them to be disgusted that their golden child had committed identity theft against their other daughter. But the toxic roots of my family ran far deeper than any legal document could reach. Instead of holding Jada accountable, Calvin slowly stood up from his armchair and looked at me with an expression of deep annoyance. He completely ignored the massive stack of hard fraud evidence resting on the coffee table. He told me to lower my voice and stop threatening my sister. He actually had the sheer audacity to defend her criminal behavior. Right to my face. Calvin said that Jada was my flesh and blood, and that she was just under a tremendous amount of pressure to secure a good marriage. He tried to brush off the $45,000 attempted theft as a simple misunderstanding caused by wedding day panic. He looked at me and said that I obviously had plenty of money since I owned the Vanguard estate and all those other luxury properties. He demanded to know why I was being so greedy and vindictive over a few credit cards when my sister was clearly suffering. Yvonne immediately chimed in to support him. My mother wiped a fake tear from her eye and told me I was acting like a relentless, angry, and deeply unforgiving bully, she said. Jada just needed a little bit of help to maintain her lifestyle, and that as the older sister, I should have been honored to provide financial support for her journey into high society. Yvonne actually told me that stealing my identity was just Jada's way of surviving in a difficult world, and that I needed to have some grace and forgive her immediately, so the family could heal. She looked at me with an expression of deep resentment, and said that if I had just given Jada the money, she asked for none of this identity theft would have been necessary. She blamed me for forcing Jada into a life of crime because I was too stingy to share my vast corporate wealth with my own sister. I stared at the two people who brought me into this world, feeling a profound sense of absolute revulsion. They were literally defending felony, identity theft, because they believed Jada's social climbing was far more important than my legal and financial safety. They were perfectly willing to let me be robbed blind, as long as it kept the illusion of their wealthy family intact. They had no moral compass whatsoever. Their entire value system was built on maintaining a fake aesthetic and appeasing white people who secretly despised them. The sheer absurdity of my parents' enabling behavior was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, disgusted laugh from the corner of the room. Caroline Kensington, who had been sitting quietly processing the absolute destruction of both families, finally stood up. She smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress and looked at my parents with an expression of pure, unadulterated loathing. Caroline announced that she had heard more than enough. She said that my family was a complete circus of broke, desperate criminals, and that she would not spend another single minute breathing the same air as us. She looked directly at Jada, who was still crying on the sofa, and told her that the engagement was permanently over. Caroline stated that her brother Spencer would never marry into a family of ghetto identity thieves, regardless of his own financial struggles. She turned her sharp, racist gaze toward my father. Calvin Caroline demanded that he immediately reimburse the Kensington family for the severe humiliation they had endured today. She demanded $10,000 in pure cash to cover the cost of their first-class flights and their luxury hotel accommodations. She said she expected the money immediately as restitution for the absolute waste of their valuable time. The demand was incredibly arrogant considering her own brother had just been outed for wire fraud. But my father's reaction was even more pathetic. Calvin actually nodded his head in desperate agreement. His intense need to appease white people completely overrode his basic common sense. He practically bowed to Caroline and promised her that the Kensington family would receive every single penny they were owed. Calvin said. He would not allow his family honor to be tarnished by this unfortunate misunderstanding. He looked around the room and announced his grand plan to fix the situation and restore their dignity. He adjusted his wrinkled suit jacket and cleared his throat, preparing to deliver what he thought was a magnificent and highly honorable solution. Calvin proudly promised that he would go to the bank on Monday morning and take out a second mortgage on this very house to pay everyone back and clean up the entire mess. He promised Caroline that her $10,000 would be wired directly into her account by Tuesday afternoon, at the absolute latest. He stood tall, acting as though he was the honorable patriarch saving the day with his grand financial sacrifice. I stared at my father posturing, and the pure absolute hilarity of his grand declaration hit me all at once, the sheer blinding irony of a man offering up a house he did not even realize he had lost was the most delicious thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I started laughing. I threw my head back and let out a loud, uncontrollable laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the living room. The sound was deep, rich, and full of absolute, unfiltered joy. It drowned out the sound of Jada pathetic, sobbing on the sofa and completely overpowered Caroline racist demands. I laughed so hard that I had to brace my hand against the glass coffee table to keep myself steady. My laughter filled every single corner of the room, washing away decades of toxic suppression. I laughed until my chest ached and my throat burned while they all stared at me in pure, horrified confusion. They thought my mind had finally snapped under the extreme pressure. They thought I was having a hysterical breakdown. They were completely unaware of the massive, world-shattering bomb I was about to drop directly on top of their heads. The security guard Isaiah stood behind me, maintaining his strict professional composure, but I could see the faintest trace of a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth as he watched my family slowly realize that they had entirely lost control of the situation. I took one final deep breath, wiping a joyful tear from my eye, and prepared to completely end their delusional reign of terror and emotional abuse forever, without any single drop of mercy or forgiveness left in my heart to give. I looked directly at my father. Calvin, the false bravado he had displayed just moments ago, began to melt away under my cold, dead stare. I asked him in a very soft and measured tone exactly how he planned to secure a second mortgage on a property that he no longer legally owned. Calvin's face immediately lost every single drop of color. He physically stumbled backward and had to grip the back of his armchair to keep himself from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. Yvonne whipped her head around to stare at her husband, her eyes wide with total confusion and rising panic. She asked him what I was talking about, and demanded that he tell her I was just making up cruel lies to further humiliate them. Calvin could not even look at his wife. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, his shoulders completely slumped in absolute defeat. I did not wait for him to confess his miserable secrets. I reached into my thick black binder and pulled out a heavily stapled packet of official county court documents. I held the papers up so the entire room could see the bold black text printed across the top page. I read the official notice of default and foreclosure out loud, my voice steady and completely void of any mercy. I told Yvonne that her honorable, wealthy husband had not made a single mortgage payment on this beautiful, sprawling estate in over 9 months. Yvonne let out a loud, dramatic gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. Continued reading the financial autopsy of my own parents. I explained that Calvin had completely drained their joint savings accounts and quietly liquidated his retirement funds to secretly pay for Jada's extravagant influencer lifestyle. He had funded her designer clothes, her luxury car leases, and the massive deposits for her fake high-society wedding, all while allowing their primary residence to slide into total financial ruin. He had kept the foreclosure notices completely hidden from Yvonne. The bank had officially foreclosed on the property 6 months ago, while they were all busy agonizing over the perfect shade of blush pink for my bridesmaid dress. The revelation hit Yvonne like a massive freight train. The woman who had spent my entire life obsessed with social status and wealthy aesthetics suddenly realized she was entirely destitute and on the verge of being homeless. She turned all of her aggressive toxic energy directly onto Calvin. Calvin, Yvonne began screaming at him, her voice cracking. With pure hysterical rage, she hit him repeatedly on the shoulder, demanding to know how he could be so incredibly stupid and reckless. She screamed that he had completely ruined her life and that she would be the ultimate laughingstock of their entire church congregation and country club community. Calvin just stood there taking the physical and verbal abuse without a single word of defense. He knew he was completely trapped in his own catastrophic lies. As Jada began to wail again, clutching a throw pillow to her chest as she realized her primary source of funding was permanently gone. She had bled our parents completely dry to impress Spencer, and now there was absolutely nothing left to steal. Spencer and Caroline Kensington watched the family implosion with wide, shocked eyes. The two broke scammers were witnessing another family of broke scammers tear themselves apart over fake wealth and stolen identities. The sheer poetic irony of the entire situation was absolutely beautiful to watch. Stood silently behind the glass coffee table, allowing my family to fully absorb the devastating reality of their financial destruction. They had spent decades treating me like garbage because they believed my honest hard work was inferior to their performative wealth. Now they were standing in a foreclosed house screaming at each other over empty bank accounts and shattered reputations. But I was not quite finished. The ultimate checkmate was still resting safely inside my black leather binder. I waited until Yvonne ran out of breath, and Calvin sank back down into his armchair, looking thoroughly destroyed. I spoke up again, my voice effortlessly cutting through the heavy, lingering tension in the living room. I told them that when a major banking institution forecloses on a luxury property, they often seek to quietly offload the toxic debt to private investment firms. I explained that banks prefer to recover a portion of their massive losses quickly rather than deal with the lengthy and expensive process of evicting residents. I reached into my binder one final time and pulled out the original certified property deed for the sprawling estate. We were currently standing inside the document was enclosed in a protective plastic sleeve, and it featured the official embossed seal of the county registrar. I slid the heavy document across the glass coffee table, pushing it directly in front of my mother, Yvonne. I told them that the bank had auctioned off the debt on their home to a highly exclusive blind trust holding company. I watched Yvonne slowly lean forward and read the name of the purchasing entity, printed clearly on the deed. She read the words, Vanguard Holdings out loud, her voice shaking violently as the realization slowly dawned on her. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and delivered the final absolute crushing blow. I told my parents that I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I told them that when I saw their address appear on a list of distressed luxury properties targeted for acquisition, I authorized my legal team to purchase the debt entirely in cash. I informed them that I held the title to the land, the walls, the roof, and the very floorboards beneath their feet. I said, my voice echoing with absolute undeniable power. I legally own this entire estate, and you are currently trespassing on my private property. The psychological shift in the room was immediate and intensely sickening to witness. My mother, Yvonne, who had spent the last 32 years telling me I was too black, too loud, and too embarrassing to belong in her family, suddenly underwent a complete and total transformation. The terrifying reality of impending homelessness completely shattered her toxic pride. Yvonne actually slipped off her armchair and fell directly to her knees on the hardwood floor. She crawled forward until she was at the edge of the glass coffee table, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face. The aggressive, domineering matriarch had vanished, completely replaced by a pathetic, desperate beggar. Yvonne reached out her hands toward me, pleading with a voice dripping in fake maternal affection. She called me her beautiful, intelligent, and wildly successful daughter. She sobbed that we were blood, and that family always takes care of family in times of desperate need. She told me she always knew I was destined for absolute greatness, and that my vast wealth was a true blessing from God meant to save our family from this terrible tragedy. She begged me to let them stay in the house, claiming we could finally be a real loving family now that all the secrets were out in the open. I watched the desperate hope completely drain out of Yvonne's eyes, replacing it with a cold, hollow realization that she had permanently lost her favorite scapegoat. She slowly lowered her head and slumped back against the edge of the glass coffee table, completely defeated. I turned my attention away from her and looked directly at my father. Calvin, who was still sitting frozen in his armchair, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse into absolute dust. I reached into my thick, black binder one more time and pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper printed with bold black legal text. I slapped the document down onto the glass table right next to the property deed and the extensive evidence of Jada felony identity theft. I told Calvin that since I was the legal owner of this sprawling estate, I had the absolute right to determine exactly who was allowed to reside within its walls. I informed him that the piece of paper resting on the table was a formal legal 30-day notice of eviction. I told my parents and my sister that they had exactly 1 month to pack up all of their belongings and permanently vacate my private property. Calvin stared at the eviction notice, his mouth opening and closing, without producing any sound. He could not believe that his own daughter was officially kicking him out onto the street. I leaned forward and placed both of my hands flat on the glass table, projecting my voice so that there was absolutely no room for any misunderstanding. I told Calvin and Yvonne that they needed to be very careful during the moving process. I explicitly warned them that if a single fixture was damaged, if a single wall was scratched, or if any appliances were mysteriously broken or missing when they vacated the premises, the consequences would be incredibly severe. I looked over at Jada, who was still crying silently on the white velvet sofa. I told my parents that if they did not leave the estate in absolutely pristine condition, I would not hesitate to take the massive stack of fraud evidence directly to the authorities. I promised them that I would press full criminal charges against Jada for the $45,000 of attempted credit card theft and the extensive identity fraud she had committed using my social security number. I told them that Jada's fate was entirely in their hands. They could leave my property quietly and peacefully, or they could watch their golden child go to a federal prison for a very long time. Yvonne let out a loud, tragic wail, covering her face with her hands, as the sheer weight of my ultimatum crushed whatever tiny sliver of defiance she had left. Calvin slowly nodded his head, his eyes never leaving the eviction notice resting on the table. He finally understood that I held absolute total control over their entire future. The heavy silence in the living room was suddenly broken by a strange, rhythmic flashing light reflecting off the large front windows of the estate. Red and blue lights pierced through the darkness of the evening, casting eerie shifting shadows across the walls and the high vaulted ceilings. A low mechanical hum grew louder as multiple vehicles pulled up the long circular driveway, coming to a complete stop right outside the heavy oak front door. Everyone in the room froze, their heads turning toward the windows in pure confusion and rising panic. Spencer Kensington, who was still sitting on the floor near the tipped-over dining chair, suddenly went completely rigid. His face turned a sickly shade of pale green as he realized exactly what those flashing lights meant. I stood up straight and smoothed down the front of my silk blouse, feeling a deep, thrilling sense of ultimate satisfaction. I had not just been sitting idly in my Hawaiian villa drinking mimosas while watching the chaos unfold at the Vanguard estate earlier that afternoon. I had taken the incredibly detailed security report from Elias along with the blatantly forged federal wire transfer document that Spencer had submitted, and I had forwarded all of the evidence directly to my corporate legal team. My lawyers had immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the local law enforcement authorities, presenting them with undeniable concrete proof of massive wire fraud, attempted grand larceny, and the production of fraudulent banking documents. The authorities did not take wire fraud lightly. especially when it involved hundreds of thousands of dollars and luxury commercial real estate. Spencer had thought he was so incredibly smart, playing his little high society games, but he had essentially handed the police a perfectly wrapped confession. The heavy brass handle on the front door turned, and a loud, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet house. Isaiah, my massive security guard, walked over to the entryway and pulled the door open, revealing two stern-looking police detectives wearing dark suits and holding official badges. They stepped into the living room, their eyes scanning the chaotic scene before landing directly on the terrified groom, cowering on the hardwood floor. The lead detective announced his presence and stated that he was looking for Spencer Kensington. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and declared that he held an active warrant for his immediate arrest for felony wire fraud and the production of forged financial documents. Spencer let out a loud, pathetic squeak of pure terror. He scrambled backward across the floor, trying to press himself into the corner of the room as if he could magically disappear into the wallpaper. He started stammering and crying, begging the detectives to listen to him. He claimed it was all a massive misunderstanding and that he was a victim of a terrible banking error. He pointed a shaking finger at Jada and screamed that she was the one who had lied about her wealth, setting him up to fail. He tried to use his rich white privilege one last time, demanding to call his powerful family lawyers. But the detectives were completely unfazed by his desperate, pathetic performance. They walked over to the corner, grabbed Spencer by the arms, and hauled him roughly to his feet. They spun him around and slammed him against the wall, pulling his arms behind his back, the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing loudly through the silent room. Spencer began to sob uncontrollably as the detective loudly read him his Miranda rights, detailing his right to remain silent and his right to an attorney. The great old money patriarch, the man my sister had completely altered her entire identity to impress, was being treated like a common street criminal right in the middle of my parents' living room. Caroline Kensington, who had been demanding $10,000 in cash just moments ago, watched her brother get handcuffed with an expression of pure absolute horror. She realized that her family fake wealth could not save them from federal fraud charges. She slowly backed away from the center of the room, keeping her eyes locked on the detectives. She did not say a single word in defense of her brother. She did not try to argue with the police or demand that they release him. Instead, the arrogant racist woman who had called my catering staff ghetto turned around and quietly slinked out the back sliding glass door, abandoning her own brother to save her own skin. She completely vanished into the dark night, running away from the catastrophic consequences of their mutual scam. Jada watched her entire perfect influencer life completely disintegrate right before her eyes. She watched the wealthy white family she worshipped run away and abandon her. She watched her supposed billionaire fiancé get marched out the front door in heavy steel handcuffs, crying like a terrified little boy. The illusion she had sacrificed her own sister to protect was entirely dead. Jada threw her head back and let out a loud, agonizing scream of pure, unadulterated devastation. She screamed until her throat was raw, mourning the permanent death of her fake high society future. She was left with nothing but an oversized gray sweatshirt, a foreclosed house, and the terrifying reality of her own impending criminal charges. If she did not comply with my eviction demands, Yvonne and Calvin sat in their armchairs, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction they had just witnessed. Their golden child was a broke, desperate felon, their perfect son-in-law was on his way to a federal lockup, and their beautiful, sprawling estate belonged entirely to the daughter they had treated like absolute garbage for 32 years. I looked around the living room, taking in the spectacular wreckage of their toxic empire. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering sadness. I felt nothing but the clean, sharp air of absolute total freedom. I closed the heavy leather cover of my black binder and slipped it back into my briefcase. Snapping the metallic lock shut, the crisp clicking sound broke the trance that had settled over my parents. Calvin finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, silent plea for mercy that I would never, ever grant. Yvonne reached out her hand one last time, trembling and weak. But she could not find the courage to speak another single word to me. They knew it was completely over. I turned away from them and signaled to my massive security guard, Isaiah, with a brief, subtle nod. He stepped forward and opened the heavy oak front door, letting the cool, refreshing night air sweep into the stale, toxic living room. I walked out the door with my head held high, my spine perfectly straight, and my natural hair blowing beautifully in the evening breeze. I left them sitting in the ruins of their own spectacular making, surrounded by the ashes of their shallow, deceitful choices. I stepped into the back of my waiting luxury vehicle completely unbothered, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure wash over my entire soul forever and always. The drive back to the airport that night was the most peaceful journey of my entire life. I sat in the back of the luxury sport utility vehicle, watching the bright streetlights of Atlanta blur past the dark-tinted windows. Isaiah, my massive security guard, sat in the front seat, maintaining his usual quiet vigilance. But the heavy, suffocating tension that had followed us into my parents' house was completely gone. I had finally excised the massive toxic tumor that had been draining my energy and destroying my peace for 32 years. I did not feel any lingering guilt or sadness about leaving my mother, Yvonne, my father Calvin, and my sister Jada to deal with the catastrophic consequences of their own deeply selfish actions. I felt incredibly light, as if gravity itself had suddenly lost its hold on my body. I boarded my private flight back to my actual life, leaving the absolute wreckage of their fake high society illusions burning brightly in my rearview mirror. The next 6 months passed in a beautiful blur of absolute unparalleled success and profound personal peace. While my real estate empire continued to expand and thrive, the miserable people I had left behind were slowly crushed under the immense weight of their own criminal choices and superficial priorities. My sister Jada experienced the most spectacular and deeply humiliating downfall imaginable. The live video of her rolling around in the dirt outside the locked iron gates of the Vanguard estate, tearing at her heavy lace wedding dress, while physically fighting with Caroline Kensington, went incredibly viral on every single social media platform. The internet instantly dubbed it the Fire Festival of Weddings, and the sheer volume of public mockery was absolutely relentless. Her entire carefully curated influencer aesthetic was permanently destroyed overnight. The luxury beauty and fashion brands that used to send her free products immediately severed all ties, not wanting to be associated with a broke identity thief who brawled on the side of a rural highway. Jada tried to post a tearful apology video, claiming she was the innocent victim of a cruel family prank. But the wedding guests who had been locked out mercilessly flooded her comment section, exposing her massive web of lies. They posted screenshots of the police arriving and told the entire world that her billionaire groom was actually a broke fraud. The severe online backlash forced Jada to completely delete all of her social media accounts permanently, erasing the fake life she had sacrificed me to build, without my corporate credit cards to steal, and without Calvin draining his retirement funds to support her. Jada was forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of actual adulthood. She currently works as a shift supervisor at a cheap, fast fashion retail store in a dying suburban shopping mall, spending her days folding polyester shirts and dealing with angry customers, earning barely enough minimum wage to survive. I heard through the grapevine that she constantly wears oversized sunglasses and pulls her uniform hat down low over her face, hoping that none of her former internet followers will recognize her when they walk into the store to buy cheap clearance items. The girl, who told me my honest property management job was an embarrassment to the family name, is now sweeping up dust bunnies in a mall food court, hiding from the very public she used to desperately crave. My parents, Calvin and Yvonne, faced an equally devastating reality check. They were legally evicted from my sprawling estate, exactly 30 days after I dropped the formal notice on their glass coffee table. They had nowhere to go and absolutely no money left to maintain their wealthy facade. They were forced to rent a cramped, deeply depressing two-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood, far away from the affluent suburbs. They used to proudly claim their luxury leased vehicles were quickly repossessed, leaving them completely dependent on a highly unreliable public transit system to get to the discount grocery stores. The loss of their massive house and their cars was only the beginning of their punishment. The absolute worst part for Yvonne was the total destruction of her precious social standing. The members of their elite church congregation and their exclusive country club community completely ostracized them. The high society friends they had spent decades trying to impress suddenly stopped returning their phone calls and started pretending they did not exist. When Yvonne ran into former acquaintances at the local pharmacy, they would quickly turn their shopping carts around and walk down a different aisle, treating her like she carried a highly contagious disease. Yvonne and Calvin were completely banished from the only social circles they had ever truly cared about. They now spend their miserable days sitting in their tiny apartment, listening to their noisy neighbors through the thin drywall and blaming each other for their catastrophic financial ruin. Yvonne blames Calvin for losing the house, and Calvin blames Yvonne for enabling Jada's destructive behavior. They are permanently trapped in a suffocating prison of their own design, with no golden child left to worship and no scapegoat daughter left to abuse. The great Spencer Kensington, the man who thought his white skin and his fake old money lineage gave him the ultimate right to manipulate my family and steal from my company, was denied bail. He is currently sitting in a federal lockup facility, wearing a cheap, scratchy orange jumpsuit instead of a custom-tailored tuxedo, awaiting trial for multiple counts of massive wire fraud and attempted grand larceny. His highly publicized arrest brought immense federal scrutiny down upon his entire family, exposing his parents, massive tax evasion schemes, and resulting in the immediate foreclosure of their heavily mortgaged Connecticut estate. Caroline Kensington, the arrogant racist woman who demanded a white catering staff and called my employees ghetto, is currently hiding from the public eye, completely humiliated and entirely destitute. Her elite social circle abandoned her. The exact moment the federal indictments were handed down, the Kensington dynasty was officially dead, buried under a mountain of undeniable criminal charges and spectacular public disgrace. While they were all suffocating in the dark misery of their own consequences, I was busy preparing to host the most magnificent and empowering event of my entire professional career. I stood on the grand sweeping balcony of the Vanguard estate, overlooking the sprawling botanical gardens and the crystal-clear reflecting lake. The exact same property where Jada had tried to host her exclusionary fake high society wedding was now transformed into a breathtaking sanctuary of genuine Black excellence, was hosting a massive, highly exclusive luxury gala specifically designed to honor and uplift Black female entrepreneurs from across the country. I wanted to create a safe, beautiful space where women who looked exactly like me could gather to celebrate their immense power, their brilliant minds, and their undeniable beauty without ever having to shrink themselves to fit into a restrictive white aesthetic. The entire estate was decorated in vibrant, rich colors, deep emerald greens, striking royal purples, and brilliant gold accents that perfectly complemented the rich brown skin of every single woman in attendance. The catering staff, the very same talented Black professionals that Caroline Kensington had tried to fire, were serving an exquisite 5-course menu to hundreds of powerful, successful women. I had personally promoted Sarah, the catering director, to oversee all elite events across my entire real estate portfolio, ensuring she received the respect and financial compensation she truly deserved. She had designed a menu that honored our cultural heritage, elevating traditional dishes into pure culinary masterpieces. The air was filled with the joyous sounds of laughter, networking, and a live rhythm and blues band, playing beautiful, soulful music that echoed across the perfectly manicured lawns. I looked absolutely radiant standing on the balcony, the warm evening breeze gently catching the fabric of my custom-tailored emerald silk gown. I wore my natural hair exactly how I wanted it, styled in a beautiful, intricate crown of thick, dark curls that highlighted my features perfectly. There was no pale blush pink dress, washing out my complexion. There was no toxic mother whispering in my ear, telling me to be quieter or less visible. I was surrounded by my loyal executive team, including David, my ruthless corporate attorney, and Elias, my meticulous estate manager, who were both smiling and ensuring the event ran with absolute perfection. I was surrounded by my genuine friends and the brilliant women who had supported me when I was just a struggling girl, working late nights in a cramped studio apartment. They were my true chosen family people who valued my mind, my heart, and my unyielding work ethic. They did not care about proximity to whiteness or fake social status. They cared about building real generational wealth and lifting each other up. I looked out over the massive crowd of beautiful black women laughing and sharing their brilliant business strategies on the pristine lawns of my massive estate. I felt a profound sense of overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this exact moment. I had survived the relentless emotional abuse of a family that never truly saw my worth, and I had transformed all of that pain into a thriving, beautiful empire. I realized that holding on to the hope that my blood relatives would someday love me unconditionally was the only thing that had ever truly held me back. The moment I let go of that impossible dream, I became completely unstoppable. I thought back to the fitting room in that pretentious bridal boutique. I remembered the cold, heavy feeling in my chest when I read the text message telling me I was too unkempt and too embarrassing to attend a wedding. I remembered the sheer audacity of my mother telling me to let my sister secure a bag that did not even exist. They had wanted to erase me from their picture-perfect world. But all they did was hand me the exact motivation I needed to erase them from mine. The blood that ran through our veins meant absolutely nothing without basic human respect. I had spent my entire youth trying to earn a seat at a table that was actively rotting from the inside out. And now I was standing on the balcony of a multi-million-dollar property that I owned, free and clear, looking down at a table I had built entirely with my own hands. The night sky began to fill with brilliant shining stars, perfectly reflecting off the still waters of the private lake below. The band transitioned into a slow, beautiful melody, and the women on the lawn raised their glasses to toast the success of their sisters. I picked up a crystal flute filled with the finest vintage champagne and walked to the very edge of the grand stone balcony, looking out over the magnificent property I had built entirely from scratch. I thought about the cruel text message my sister had sent me so many months ago, claiming I was an embarrassment to her fake, pristine world. I thought about my mother demanding I accept their disrespect just to secure a miserable, unfulfilling future. I raised my glass slightly allowing the golden sparkling liquid to catch the light of the elegant patio lanterns, and I spoke my final truth out loud, letting my voice carry on the warm evening breeze. They told me I did not fit the aesthetic. They told me I was not worthy of a seat at the table, so I bought the table, the estate, and the very ground they walked on, and then I evicted them. Sometimes the only way to heal from a toxic family is to let them choke on their own poison. My name is Aaliyah, and my aesthetic is strictly peace, power, and property. The profound lesson from this story is that your true worth is never defined by toxic family members who demand you shrink yourself to fit their shallow narratives. Real power comes from walking away from tables where respect is no longer served, and instead, boldly building your own empire. You owe absolutely nothing to people who only value your existence when it benefits their selfish agendas. Authentic healing requires the strength to enforce strict boundaries and let those who mistreated you face the consequences of their own toxic choices. Please like, subscribe, and share this video to support